Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to RUSI. A particularly warm welcome to our members and to those who have travelled, all our guests. You've certainly brought the weather with you. In many ways, it's not snow, for which we are thankful. My name is Peter Roberts. I'm the host. I'm the Director of Military Science. I'm the host for the next 2 days. There's a whole team of people from RUSI to help you get in problems. Sid's at the back, Mike Codner, who most of you know through the previous 17 incarnations of this conference. There's also Sarge, Alana and Sabrina downstairs. Any one of the RUSI team be happy to help you with whatever you need. All the facilities, you should have found them already. Heads and bathrooms are all up and down on the half floors and around. But indeed, if in any doubt, please do ask. Could I ask you all as a first sign to all raise your right hands, please? It's a bit of audience participation. Now, could I ask you to reach in, pick up your mobile phone and turn it to silent? There is nothing more frustrating than as a speaker or a chairman than ringtones going off. And I know you all probably have some very interesting ringtones, particularly with this group we've got with us. A bit of health and safety. We're not expecting any alarms. If we are, they'll be for real. And the RUSI staff will escort you out. We're up a little bit higher here, so we'll take you down one of the exits. Please don't use the lift. It's not reliable at the best of times, and I would hate for you to have to wait there a while where we can't provide you any booze or food, which would obviously put you off your enduring membership with the Institute. But follow the directions of the staff. We will all muster at one of the points outside. You might go out the back of the building or the front of the building. Either way, you'll find yourself directed by RUSI staff, ticked off, and then probably told to go to one of the 5 pubs on Whitehall before returning at some later time. We're not funding the first round of drinks. If there is a lockdown procedure, and sometimes you'll have been here when there are attacks in Whitehall, you're in the a pretty well-protected city, then across the road we have one of the Guards regiments of the British Army. You'll see the horses and stuff. They do have modern sabres. And the Metropolitan Police are good enough to put an armed man on the door if anything kicks off. So you are pretty fine. If it's a lockdown, you'll be asked to stay in, and we'll just carry on. We've made sure this time that we have enough wine to keep you going through the various machinations and discussions, and allows a greater opportunity for networking. Really like to thank Lockheed Martin and Raytheon for sponsoring and enabling this conference. We didn't do it last year. The last time we got together was in 2016, and we thought, well, we'll wait for the critical policy statements to come out. And we waited and waited and waited. And while we were waiting, it seemed that everything was going on at this massive pace. And actually, we just couldn't wait for the policy. And I think some people might start to talk about how that is becoming clear later in the conference. We look at actions that are happening in Israel, with DPRK, with rebel Houthi groups in Yemen. We are seeing the use of missile systems to make political statements. I mean, they're not necessarily of tactical utility, but politically, they're regarded with very high value by competitors and adversaries. And I think if that's clearer in any one facet, it's in the proliferation of these systems, and not just simple proliferations in the way that we expected. We see it leapfrogging generations in a way that had not been predicted. And I think that's one of the key themes that will come out when we see the development in European, Asian and Middle Eastern states. The way things are developing have trends in terms of the pace, the unpredictability, the proliferation of systems, and the use of these systems for political purposes. It's very different from the way that many militaries envisage it, and part of our job at the Institute is to educate and enlighten various people. But we've also seen an absence of some things. And in the UK and other European capitals, what's clear is there's an absence of a compelling narrative. Why should you buy? What is the threat to us? And often these discussions come too late. In the case of resilience, where it's about Salisbury or other things, you see politicians and decision makers, influencers making decisions a little on the back foot. So part of this discussion is about bringing the debate forward into the public light. There is also a lack of ambition ambition beyond what has been discussed previously. And we're still living with statements that have been made, up to 5 years ago, whilst the actions have progressed elsewhere. There is a huge amount to discuss, not just because of the 2 years, because of the pace of change that we've seen in this environment. So, on the basis of that, I'll introduce my boss, Professor Malcolm Chalmers. Malcolm will chair the first session, and without further ado, we will crack on. Welcome. Can we bring up the first set of speakers, please? Frank. Right.
Peter, thank you very much, and thank you to you and your colleagues for all the work that went into preparing this conference. I guess if this is the 18th conference of this sort, then the first must have been held in the 20th century. Is that right, Mike? Which is a long time ago, isn't it? And an awful lot has happened, and I'm struck by the fact that, as Peter has already mentioned, the pace of international events, even over the last year, has been quite astounding, and many of them relevant to the topic you're going to be talking about today and tomorrow. A new, fairly new now, president in the United States, behavior in Russia, what's happening in Syria today with a very direct missile component, and of course, every day a new contradictory development in relation to North Korea. And therefore, the fact that you're talking about, in many ways, the same subject at each of these conferences over this period takes place against a strategic backdrop which is rapidly changing. And I guess one of the big messages from those developments almost week to week is that it's really hard to predict what's going to happen next week, far less in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And an important aspect of discussions like this is precisely to be able to think longer term, because building capabilities takes such a long time. And we're going to be discussing various different dimensions of those capability issues over the next couple of days, but set in a political context. I think one of the functions we try to fulfill here at RUSI is not so much to have a highly technical discussion about particular systems, but to put them in the broader military and strategic context. And I think that's very important. We have 3 excellent members of the panel who are going to be discussing the United States Ballistic Missile Defense Review and its broader implications for Atlantic security. The initial contributions from our 3 panelists will be on the record, which means that you can tweet about them, or if you're a member of the media, then you can write about them, and they will be on our RUSI feed on our website. So they're all attributable to those individuals. The comments thereafter in answers to questions, indeed the questions themselves, will be off the record, so we'll turn off the cameras at the back and people can be even more frank than they've been in their oral remarks. The first speaker, could I like to invite to the podium, Brad Clark, the Director of Nuclear Policy from the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon in the US. And we're absolutely delighted you could be with us today, Brad. So the floor is yours.
Hi, for those of you that don't know me, and I think that's most of you, I'm Brad Clark. I'm the Principal Director for Nuclear Missile Defense Policy and OSD Policy at the Pentagon. I've been there about 5 years, and my main focus has been nuclear deterrence policy. So in missile defense, I'm to some extent stepping into the shoes of greater men, but I'll do my best. My background is in detention policy, and U.S. detention policy has not always been the most popular subject in national security studies, and so I'm used to defending unpopular policies. I'm not as used to explaining policies that I can't explain yet because they haven't been issued yet, but I'll give it a go this morning. What I can talk about, since the MDR is still in draft, and you know, it'll be issued when it's issued. So, and I can't, it's embargoed to some extent. But what I can talk about, I guess, is the policy trajectory on missile defense in the Trump administration up to today, both from the starting point and then through some of the major policy documents that have been issued already. The National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Nuclear Posture Review. And so policy in any new administration, it doesn't start at zero. It starts at a baseline of the previous administration, right? And so, and you react and you guide off that and you adjust as your political philosophy tells you to adjust or as events in the world tell you to adjust. And so our baseline is the 2010 MDR, which had some major themes and some minor themes. And so the major themes, the aspirations were, one, to defend the homeland with a focus on regional or rogue threats. And more than that, to maintain the advantageous position that we thought we had in 2010. And so not just defend, but to stay ahead of the threat. On regional missile threats, to defend forces, our deployed forces, allies, and partners, and also to enable allies and partners to increase their own defense by leading expanded international efforts. And that'll morph into something a little bit different over time. And then one of the supporting themes was to ensure that capabilities remained flexible and adaptable as threats change. Because as has been referenced by both gentlemen that preceded me on the speaker, the velocity of change has been pretty dramatic since 2010 and really particularly over the last 5 years. Other policy positions in the 2010 NPR, which should be familiar to the audience, is on Russia and China. We specifically disavowed our intent to affect what was called the strategic balance with either country. The focus was on regional threats. Russia and China were not the focus. Although the review did note concerns with Chinese missile developments and an intention to defend our interests in the Asia Pacific. So the idea of engaging regional threats was certainly in the review. And we've certainly seen it since. Geopolitically, we look toward a dialogue with China and a dialogue or even cooperation with Russia, but not at the expense of our capabilities. We specifically said we're not going to reject any negotiated restraints on our missile defenses. All right, so that's 2010. So that's where you start. And that policy, and frankly, I have more to say on this, didn't remain static. Over time, the things that we were concerned about in 2010 got worse. We were unable to achieve any meaningful dialogue with China or Russia. The cooperation did not develop. The threat to deployed forces, allies, and partners from theater range systems grew dramatically in some sense. In both capacity, both in the number of missiles and the capabilities of those missiles, not just today, but looking ahead into the not too distant future. And the threat to the United States got worse. The 2 ICBM tests last year were sort of an exclamation point on an accelerating threat trend. And the Obama administration did adapt to those changes, increasing GBI capacity, promoting increased regional capabilities. One of the great ambassadors of that, Frank Rose, is here today, that really pushed that. So that's how the Trump administration came in. And so it looked at a security environment that we really kind of touched on. And also what's been phrased in different documents as a reemergence of great power competition. Right? And so that really sort of frames how we look at the regional missile threat, is through that lens. And you see that reflected throughout the different strategy documents. So you start with the National Security Strategy, right, which speaks to both homeland and regional missile defense. And it commits to enhancing missile defense through a layered missile defense system to deploy the homeland, focused on North Korea and Iran, but also includes, which is a new wrinkle, the ability to defeat threats prior to launch. And so prior to the NSS, we called this warfighting, right? I mean, that's what you do, is you attack an adversary's offensive capabilities, be they missiles, aircraft, armor, whatever they might be. But here it's been linked sort of explicitly into the missile defense framework, which is not necessarily brand new, but it's new to see it expressed in a policy document. And then again, the disclaimer that we, as we develop these missile defense capabilities, we really are not targeting the strategic stability or the strategic capabilities of Russia and China. There's a little bit more on Indo-Pacific, both in the NSS and the National Defense Strategy. We'll want to maintain a forward presence in the region, which will be supported by missile defense efforts. It's getting at the A2AD problem. Strengthening the deterrence on NATO's eastern flank, improving NATO air and missile defense. And then another sort of new inject is a reference to cruise missile threats, principally but not exclusively from Iran. So cruise missile defense is a newer wrinkle. And in the Middle East to a push toward procuring interoperable missile defense, so increasing capacity through interoperability, which isn't, again, new. It's an element of continuity. So again, should be a very familiar, everything in the national security strategy should be very familiar to people who pay attention to missile defense, with a couple new wrinkles or inflection points. National defense strategy, at least the public portion, is less specific. What it does say specifically is that, again, we'll have layered missile defenses and disruptive capabilities, which is a new element. Again, that kind of kicks back to national security strategies, defeating threats prior to launch. And it focuses both on theater missile defense and North Korea ballistic missile threats. So layered, both theater and homeland, and missile, not ballistic missile, right? So we're looking at all of them now. And again, that's a sign of the threat changing, both in terms of the numbers and types of offensive missiles. Some indirect things, the NDS approach, National Defense Strategy approach, is to build a more lethal force, to strengthen alliances, attract new partners, and to reform the department, which I'm not going to speak to because that is things I don't understand. But on strengthening alliances and building lethality, you can see how missile defense weaves into that. The defense strategy sets regional objectives as well, right? To expand our Indo-Pacific alliances, to fortify NATO, and to form enduring coalitions in the Middle East. So those are regional objectives. Objectives that support that are to deepen interoperability. There's that word again. All right, missile defense is an area where it really does matter what your partners do because you can create a synthesis that's greater than the individual parts. An objective for increased flexibility and freedom of action, that's the A2AD problem, right? America surges forces. We need to be able to do that, right? Which means you need airfields, you need ports, and you need to defend those things. And then the global operating model, if you look into that, this is very little in the strategy, but there are 4 layers. There's a contact layer, a blunt layer, a surge layer, and a homeland layer. Homeland defense fits into the homeland layer pretty neatly. Theater defenses fit into the blunt and surge layers, right? The blunt layer is about degrading aggression. Defeating it if you can, denying it if you can, but at least degrading or disrupting or delaying aggressive action until you can surge forces into the region. The role of theater missile defense is pretty obvious, I think, in that construct. The posture review, the nuclear posture review, well, it focused on nuclear posture, so it doesn't talk a lot about missile defense, but it does talk a little bit about it. It does note the role of missile defense and damage limitation, which is, an old idea, but it focuses that specifically to the North Korean and Iranian context, right? So if you look at the tailored strategies for the different nuclear states, missile defense is pulled in the greatest detail in North Korea and incorporated more by reference in the Iranian section. But you can see the role. Again, that ties back to our aspirations for homeland defense, is focusing on regional powers and rogue states. And so the point of all this, if there is a point, is that the MDR isn't written in a vacuum. There's a policy framework that it's going to fit into. And that policy framework has been set to a large degree by the national security strategy and the national defense strategies and the nuclear posture review. And so the themes that you've seen in that, many of which are consistent with the 2010 policy, are themes that you can perhaps expect to see, at least not a lot of divergence from when it comes out. And some of the things in this framework I just want to foot stomp is, the NPR's reliance principally on deterrence to address Russian and Chinese strategic threats. The national security strategy and NPR focus on homeland defense against North Korean and Iranian threats. The focus in the security and defense strategies on addressing the regional missile threats, right? That's both in there and big. Again, we dropped the B, so it's MDR. We're worried about, look, advanced tech, advanced cruise missiles, hypersonics, countermeasures, all those things that complicate missile defense to the point where a lot of people want to throw up their hands are a problem that we really do want to get after. The budget submissions, I think, reflect these interests. And then you saw a reflection of it in the testimony, I think just last month, of my boss, Undersecretary John Rood, and Lieutenant General Greaves of the Missile Defense Agency. And so when John Rood was talking on the Hill, he was concerned about proliferation, right? Over 20 states have offensive missiles. You know, the expanded threat in terms of the numbers, capabilities of these missiles, and more than that, the integration of these capabilities into the warfighting strategies and really coercive threats and as political instruments, as was referenced earlier. The velocity of the North Korean threat change, Russian and Chinese A2AD capabilities, and how in strategies as well. And the policy and posture reflects those concerns, right? We're improving our GBI system, right? We're going from 44 interceptors to 64, again, to stay ahead of the threat. There's new radars on the horizon, so we have better discrimination. We can cue quicker and engage better. We're looking at improving homeland cruise missile defense, at least in the national capital region, because we're worried candidly about decapitation strikes. And enhancing regional defense is a big emphasis toward the end of the last administration. It's going to be a big emphasis now. And advanced technology, which wasn't talked about as much in 2010, is starting to get into the discussions now. So better sensors, space sensors, lasers, boost phase intercepts, the MOKV, you know, multiple kill vehicles on interceptor, all those are ways to stay ahead of the threat. And if the threat continues to accelerate and metastasize at the same time, those are going to be pretty key. So while I can't really forecast, again, you're going to you can look at what's come, and you can look and expect to see some consistency as we look to adjust our policy and posture to threats, changes in the threat environment, and the velocity of those changes. Thank you.
Brad, thank you so much for that introduction to the missile defense review in contrast to our program. Absolutely excellent introduction and raising some really interesting questions towards the end, which I'm sure we will want to explore further. Our next speaker is well known to those of you who have attended this conference before, indeed those of you who have been involved in the policy process in relation to missile defense in recent years. Frank, of course, served with distinction throughout the 2 terms of the Obama administration in the State Department, first as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Space and Defense Policy, and then as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance, and is now, I think, at the Foreign Policy Programme at Brookings. So he is well qualified, both by background and also on his current research, to make a commentary as to exactly where the United States is in relation to its review and the future of its missile defense policy. Over to you, Frank.
Malcolm, I'm going to talk from here, if that's okay.
I think, would you mind, Frank, if you did it from here? I apologize for making you stand, but it's much better for the video if we can have you up here.
It's all about the video.
Absolutely. That's the only reality there is.
Absolutely. Well, Malcolm, thanks very much for the kind introduction, and it's great to share the podium with Brad and Tom, 2 great colleagues from Washington. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you at the RUSI Missile Defense Conference to discuss about an issue that is near and dear to me, and that is European missile defense. As many of you know, I have worked this issue in both the Bush and Obama administrations, helping develop the NATO feasibility study in the 2000s, working with the governments of the United Kingdom and Denmark to upgrade the Tula and filing deals, early warning radars, and most recently serving as the lead negotiator for the missile defense basing agreements for the European phase adaptive approach. In my remarks today, I really want to focus on three key points. One, I'll build on Brad's remarks and discuss the Trump administration's approach to missile defense to date. Secondly, I'll highlight what I believe are likely to be some of the friction points with regards to the upcoming missile defense review. I'm no longer in government, so I can say what I want. It's a liberating feeling. And then finally, I'll discuss some of the possible implications of the upcoming U.S. missile defense review for the U.S. domestic political debate on missile defense, strategic stability with Russia and China, and our relations with our allies. But let me first begin by building upon Brad's remarks. You know, reviewing the Trump administration's actions on missile defense today, I would argue that, one, it has largely followed the approach taken by the Obama administration, and two, it has generally received bipartisan support in Congress. The Trump administration's key national security documents largely support this assessment. For example, the U.S. National Security Strategy released by the White House in December of 2017 outlines the goal of U.S. homeland missile defense by stating, quote, "The United States is deploying a layered missile defense system focused on North Korea and Iran to defend our homeland against missile attacks. This system will include the ability to defeat missile threats prior to launch. Enhanced missile defense is not intended to undermine strategic stability or disrupt long-standing strategic relationships with Russia or China," end quote. Honestly, I don't see any real difference between how the Obama administration addressed the objectives of U.S. homeland missile defense and how the Trump administration addresses it in the national security strategy. The U.S. National Defense Strategy, which Brad also referenced, released in January of this year, makes the same general point on missile defense, stating, quote, "Missile defense investments will focus on layered missile defenses and disruptive capabilities for both theater missile threats and North Korea's ballistic missile threats." And finally, the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, though it is fundamentally about nuclear posture, also has something to say with regards to missile defense in North Korea. It quotes, "We will continually improve these defensive capabilities as needed to stay ahead of North Korean missile threats if they continue to grow, while also taking steps to preclude an arms race with China or Russia." We see a consistent theme across all three of these documents, that the United States will develop layered missile defenses to address missile threats from Iran and North Korea, while at the same time trying to maintain a level of strategic stability with Russia and China. The missile defense programmatic and budget decisions that the Trump administration has taken also don't represent a major departure from the Obama administration's approach. For example, the Trump administration is continuing most of the key missile defense investments began by the Obama administration, such as continuing the development and deployment of the long-range discrimination radar in Alaska, the redesigned kill vehicle for the ground-based interceptor program, and the Aegis Ashore site in Poland, though that was delayed by a couple of years. But what I understand, and Brad could probably confirm this, is that had to do with more construction delays than anything else. They decided to do a different contractor than the contractor we used in Romania, and that unfortunately has resulted in a delay. That said, the Trump administration has made some modest adjustments to the program, such as increasing the top line funding levels for missile defense, expanding the number of long-range missile defense interceptors from 44 to 64 by 2023, and funding 2 additional long-range discrimination radars for deployment in Hawaii and at another location in the Pacific. However, none of these programmatic and budget adjustments, which are primarily focused on addressing the North Korean missile threat, are particularly controversial. Indeed, had Hillary Clinton been elected president, my guess is that her administration would likely have made many of the same adjustments to the missile defense program. However, from my perspective, the key question is this. Well, let me rephrase that. Do the Trump administration's policies to date on missile defense represent the future approach they will take, or is it merely a holding pattern while they work through these types of issues in the Missile Defense Review? I would argue, and we'll see how accurate that I am in a couple of months, on 2 key issues, specifically how to address the missile threat from Russia and China, and whether the U.S. should move forward with space-based missile defense interceptors. The current approach may be more of a holding pattern. How the Missile Defense Review addresses these 2 issues will have significant implications for the domestic consensus on missile defense within the United States, strategic relations with Russia and China, and our relations with allies. Let's begin with Russia and China. The National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Nuclear Posture Review all state that U.S. missile defenses are not intended to undermine strategic stability with Russia and China, but they also highlight the reemergence of, quote, great power competition. Indeed, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee this year on the fiscal year 2019 missile defense budget, John Rood, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Brad's current boss, my former boss, stated, quote, the central challenge to our prosperity and security is the reemergence of long-term strategic competition by revisionist powers in China and Russia, end quote. Now, while John did not specifically say that the Missile Defense Review would seek to, quote, negate Russia and China's ballistic missile defense missile capabilities, there is a serious debate ongoing in Washington as to the role missile defenses should play in responding to the threat posed by Russia and China. At this point, it is unclear how the Missile Defense Review will address Russia and China. However, if a decision is made to fundamentally alter the U.S. missile defense approach to Russia and China, it will have significant policy implications. First, from a U.S. domestic political perspective, it has the potential to shatter the current bipartisan consensus in the United States in favor of missile defense. While there is currently strong bipartisan support for addressing Iranian and North Korean missile threats, no such consensus exists to pursue a damage limitation strategy with regards to Russia and China, as some analysts argue for. There are also serious questions whether the United States has the technical capability to deal with advanced missile threats from Russia and China. Second, if the United States makes changes to its missile defense posture, Russia and China would almost certainly respond with adjustments in their own military postures. As I like to say, Russia doesn't do many things well, but they know how to build advanced missiles and very sophisticated countermeasures. Third, while there is currently a consensus among NATO allies on the need to deploy missile defenses to deal with threats emanating from, quote, outside the Euro-Atlantic area, there's no such consensus within the alliance on how to address the Russian ballistic missile threat. The other potential friction point I see coming out of the U.S. Missile Defense Review is the issue of space-based interceptor capabilities. In testimony before the House Armed Services Committee on April 17th of this year, Michael Griffin, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, said that he wanted to deploy a space-based directed energy weapon to defend the United States from long-range missiles by the late 2020s. While there would likely be bipartisan support in the United States for the development of a space-based sensor capability, I'm not sure that support would extend to the issue of space-based interceptors. This has always been controversial in the United States. And as studies by the U.S. Congressional Budget Office and other organizations have noted, there are significant technical and budgetary challenges associated with space-based interceptors. Furthermore, Russia and China see space-based interceptor capabilities as, quote, an existential threat to their strategic deterrence. Both nations would likely develop countermeasures in response to any space-based interceptor deployments by the United States. There are also serious questions about how allies would react to a decision by the United States to develop and deploy space-based interceptors. The issue of space-based interceptors has always been controversial amongst some U.S. allies, and I don't think that's changed all that much. A decision to move forward with a space-based interceptor program could create political as well as some operational problems for the United States. And why do I say that? Well, as many of you know, the U.S. missile defense system is heavily reliant on early warning radars based on Allied territory, such as the Fylingdales radar in the United Kingdom. And I see Chris Knappman, the former commander of Fylingdales, and Mike Cox, a former UEWR program manager, here in the audience. And as well as the Tula radar in Greenland and relay ground stations and command and control facilities around the world. My concern is if we kind of reignite this debate again over space-based interceptors, it could restir some of the opposition in countries around the world for their participation in the U.S. missile defense system. I don't necessarily think that is a showstopper. At the end of the day, all of our allies worked with the United States to do what we needed to do to defend the United States and our allies against ballistic missile threats. But at the same time, I don't think governments are looking for new domestic political problems if they can avoid them. And finally, let me just kind of preempt a question that I will likely get during the Q&A. And this is a question that I've received a number of times in Washington since the United States announced its decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. And the question I get is, Frank, what impact will that have on our ability to work with our allies on missile defense? And my response is, I just don't know at this point if it will have any impact whatsoever. It could, but it could not. But I will leave you with this point before I conclude, and that is, given the strong and historical anti-nuclear feelings in the publics in a number of allied countries, I think it's important to remember that arms control and non-proliferation have played a very, very important role in building domestic political consensus in many allied countries to support defense and deterrent postures, especially in the nuclear and missile defense realm. And a message that I have sent to the Trump administration, both publicly and privately, is this: you may have many concerns about arms control. And quite frankly, I share many of those concerns. But remember, in many ways, arms control and non-proliferation have played a big role in building U.S. domestic political support for strategic deterrence programs. For example, I would argue it was the New START Treaty, which was ratified in early 2011, that brought the large majority of Democrats over the line in support of the Strategic Modernization Program. And it's the same support for arms control and non-proliferation programs that have helped get the alliance to do what it needed to do with regards to nuclear decision making at NATO. In particular, the decision to procure dual-capable aircraft. So I'll leave you with that thought. I'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A session. So let me just summarize by saying, since assuming office in January 2017, the Trump administration's missile defense policy, budget, and programs have been largely consistent with those of the previous administration and have enjoyed bipartisan support from Congress. These efforts have primarily been focused on addressing the missile threat from Iran and North Korea. However, it is an open question whether the upcoming U.S. Missile Defense Review will continue that consensus, especially with regards to the role missile defense should play in addressing the threat from Russia and China, and whether the United States should move forward with space-based missile defense interceptor capabilities. How the U.S. Missile Defense Review addresses these issues will have a significant impact on the current domestic political consensus in the United States for missile defense, strategic stability with Russia and China, and the United States' relations with allies. Thank you very much.
Frank, thank you so much for those remarks. Put a lot of really interesting questions on the table. I can't help but remark that the broad structure of your talk of, on the one hand, a holding pattern and policy in the United States, but on the other hand, the possibility of some quite significant changes is a pattern that we see across administration defense policy. It's not confined to this area. And as we've seen with the JCPOA, the holding pattern sometimes doesn't last forever. And you're quite right to point out that there could be significant alliance implications, which it's very difficult to map out if that holding pattern is replaced by something different. The third contribution is going to be in the nature of a commentary on the other speeches rather than a freestanding presentation itself. Tom Karako is also going to be contributing, I think, to the next panel in a more substantive way. But we thought before we throw it open to the floor, it would be very interesting to get his perspective on the two contributions we've already had. So over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. As he said, I'm going to be quicker in my comments and really just sort of play a little bit of ping pong and respond to a couple things that were said and maybe throw back into play some of the more interesting things that were said, hopefully that they will therefore encourage some conversation about them. So I'm going to do a quick reaction about a number of things that were said here, which as I was taking notes, grouped under 6 different categories or 6 words, being adaptability, interoperability, integration, space, disruptive, and consensus. So let me just sort of work through those. The first one being adaptability. Adaptive is the first A in PAA, or EPAA, which was, of course, the foundation of the Obama administration's approach to missile defense broadly. And the foundation of the EPAA was the Aegis Ashore site. And so as I was listening to you first, Brad, but also Frank, since you were both so closely involved in that, I'd be curious about your comments about some of the characteristics of the Aegis Ashore, of the Aegis Combat System and of the Aegis Ashore program in particular, that during the Obama administration, I'm not going to ask anything MDR, that during the Obama administration had been considered as future hedge options for flexibility and adaptability, those 2 words that were used in the NPR. I'll throw out a couple ideas: flexible launchers, modularity in terms of its evolutionary baseline system going back to the 1980s, offense-defense integration. Aegis ships have offensive and defensive forces. And of course, autonomy, another kind of buzzword of the day. So I'll throw that out there. Second broad grouping is interoperability. And Brad brought this up in terms of course, U.S. and allied interoperability. I wanted to kind of put a red line under the fact that, alas, there's kind of a shortfall of interoperability even between and among U.S. air and missile defense systems. There is I'll just say that when he was still the head of of Arctic, someone by the name of General H.R. McMaster put out a document in January of 2017 referring to missile defense as a foundational capability for all the things that the United States does. That was a document that looked forward to Army capabilities out into 2040, but it also observed that the degree of interoperability and integration would not be there even by the 2030, 2040 timeframe. And I would point folks to the General Dempsey's 2013 Joint Vision IAMD 2020 for, in 7 pages, describing as good a summary of the problem there as any. There's important things going on in both the GEONs and the JUONs for especially U.S. Forces Korea, and of course the Army's pursuing IBCS there as well. Third grouping, integration. It's been frequently remarked that the missile defense review that's forthcoming began as the BMDR at presidential direction, but has become the missile defense review. I would point out that at congressional direction prior to that, it was the MDR, but it was actually the missile defeat review. And so going back, I would point you to, I think, the fall of 2016, the FY17 NDAA, that laid out 18 elements for what was kind of going to be expected of the future missile defense review. 18. That's twice the number that Congress had directed to the Obama administration for the BMDR of 2010. They basically took all 9 and then added 9 more. And those 9 more are kind of the interesting and really hard things to solve, asking for milestones on interoperability and integration and other things as well. So I'll point you to that. Think back when the MDR comes out. Those are 18 criteria that I think will be useful. The other thing on integration, and Undersecretary John Rood has made testimony about this, it's the full suite of things. It's not just about dedicated missile defense assets. He's talked in particular about F-35 and its kind of opportunistic abilities to both see missile threats and perhaps do something about them. Likewise, at a lower level, the U.S. Army's effort for SHORAD, kind of scrambling to reconstitute short-range air defense, has an element that is, I think in a way trying to reteach folks the importance of air and missile defense after a long holiday wherein we presupposed air superiority of everything. And one particular element of that is sort of non-dedicated air defense, looking up and taking a shot, if possible, whether it's an M16 or anything else. Fourth grouping is space. And I'm a little bit of a broken record on this. I would commend Frank for his comments about space sensors. In terms of that, however, I would say that notwithstanding the fact that it shouldn't be controversial and it should be done, the Trump administration thus far is the 6th U.S. administration to be dedicated to space-based sensor layer for the missile defense mission on paper. The Obama administration, in terms of the 2010 BMDR, had references to, for instance, an ABIR, airborne infrared, by 2015. Don't see a lot of that woven into the BMDS. And, of course, the PTSS balls never got fielded either. So there have been some fits and starts there. And so I would just put a line under that as this is a very important capability that helps all 4 families of missile defense interceptors, from the low end to the high end, but it hasn't yet been done. So we'll take some pushing to get that out the door. The 5th bucket is, Brad, and this might prompt you to a question. The NDS says, and you alluded to this, that investments would focus on layered missile defenses and disruptive capabilities for both theater missile threats and North Korean ballistic missile threats. That's the NDS. It's an interesting juxtaposition. North Korea has theater missiles too. North Korea has ballistic missiles. I think that the NDS is kind of alluding to the kind of the regional and homeland distinction, but it doesn't say that. It says theater and North Korean ballistic. And so I wanted to pose the question whether that might not allude to the interest in doing something for theater great power missiles, whether be they the cruise variety or otherwise. That, after all, is the central theme of the NDS. And then the final comment, and this is really to you, Frank, on consensus. You spoke, I think, elegantly about the importance to preserve that. That begins at home and also extends abroad. No policy document is as good as its implementation, or better than its implementation. But one potential obstacle to that is, of course, the political climate. And so my question for you is, what advice might you give to, say, critics of the Trump administration to avoid allowing political disagreements or political animus to color their assessments of the Missile Defense Review? What kind of restraint is important here, whether it's about NPR, and you've written about that very nicely, but also about this, kind of encouraging that sobriety and circumspection. So I'll leave it off there. Thank you.